biological conflicts relaying through the temporal lobes, that is, masculine conflicts of territory, protection, and provision, or feminine conflicts of sexuality, identity, and belonging, are extremely widespread in the Western world right now. Dr. Hammer was grateful that he looked at CAT scans before the 1990s, because after the 90s, not 1 in 100 people didn't have some kind of temporal lobe conflict going on, and usually more than one of them. So if you're part of Western civilization in the 21st century, you've almost certainly got 1 or 2 of these going on, possibly quite a few more. And the temporal lobe conflicts are always underpinned with a self-devaluation conflict of not being able to demarcate the territory. Or, put more simply, temporal lobe conflicts are about not being able to say no. Nature makes no mistakes. God does not play dice. Instead, all of creation springs forth according to a few simple, elegant rules. All of creation, including your body. Know these rules and your body comes under your control. Welcome to Mind Over Symptom, where the pattern is revealed. In the temporal lobes of your cerebral cortex, there are 8 relays that have to do with boundaries. In Germanische Heilkunde, we know which relays are active with special biological programs that have to do with boundaries because of the body symptoms and behavior symptoms that arise when these conflicts are active, as well as when they're in the healing phase. Symptoms from the right temporal lobe include bronchial symptoms, coronary artery symptoms, stomach, pancreatic duct, liver duct, and gall duct symptoms, and urinary tract symptoms on the left side of the urinary tract. Symptoms from the left temporal lobe include larynx symptoms, coronary vein and uterine cervix symptoms, symptoms in the lining of the rectum, and urinary tract symptoms on the right side. If we're having symptoms in those tissues of the body, then we're having biological conflicts related to not having good boundaries or we're having boundary problems. But there are also mental, emotional, and behavioral symptoms that come from these same biological conflicts in the temporal lobes. First, if there's any conflict on the right temporal lobe, so affecting the bronchi, coronary artery, stomach, or the ducts of the liver, gallbladder, or pancreas, or the left side of the urinary tract, there's going to be depression. And the more intense the conflict, the more severe the depression is going to be. Conversely, if there's any conflict on the left temporal lobe, that's larynx, coronary vein, and uterine cervix, or the rectum lining, or the right side of the urinary tract, there's going to be mania and compulsive or controlling impulses, risk-taking, and so on. But we also have special psychological symptoms that come up if we have a constellation of at least one active temporal lobe conflict in each temporal lobe. So these combinations of 2 or more temporal lobe conflicts produce flying constellation, that's feeling out of body or dissociating, manic depression, or what in GNM we call the post-mortal constellation. For women, there's always nymphomania or nymphodepression with that. And for men, if the territorial loss involved a sexual partner, there will be Casanova constellation. That's sort of the male corollary of nymphomania. He'll be a womanizer. Aggressive constellation, or what we in GNM call the biomanic constellation. We can also be aggressive against ourselves. That's the biodepressive constellation. It's a feeling of severe guilt. We can have demarcation constellation. That produces incontinence, frequent urination, and bedwetting, but it also produces the behaviors and compulsions diagnosed as OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's autistic constellation. It produces a spectrum of behaviors from workaholism to catatonia. And then there's the opposite of autistic constellation. That's mythomania or mythodepression, a flood of writing, talking, and fawning and people-pleasing, the joker in the room. If we have a temporal lobe constellation before we are emotionally mature, we'll be developmentally arrested until there's no more temporal lobe constellation. So So that's why boundary problems are also problems of immaturity. They go hand in hand. And also at the heart of cluster B behavior disorders is also a constellation. I call it the psychopathy or narcissism constellation. It's a three-way constellation, and it produces a lack of empathy and a loss of contact with the self. Turns people into liars, vicious liars. We can also have constellations from the temporal lobes that combine a temporal lobe conflict with a conflict in a different part of the cerebral cortex that's not in the temporal lobe. For example, the bulimia constellation involves a stomach relay in the right temporal lobe and the low blood sugar relay, the glucagon relay, on the left side of the frontal cortex. So that was a list of many of the symptoms that come from, or at least involve, one or both of the temporal lobes of your cerebral cortex. And every one of them starts with or involves not having good boundaries. And as you've observed, this is so prevalent in the world right now, it would be considered abnormal not to have one of these conditions. In fact, having good boundaries is often perceived as abnormal by the rest of us who don't have good boundaries. Why are boundary problems such a big deal? Well, not 1 in 100 of us doesn't have at least one of these special biological programs, usually 2 or more in constellation with each other going on at any given time, because we're living in a time when most people have poor boundaries, at least in certain contexts. Now, while it's understandable that most of us have poor boundaries, after all, most of us have been raised in a society that values collectivism and puts value on sacrificing our own interests for the benefit of others. So of course we haven't had good boundaries modeled for us. And we've probably even been punished or abused or lost relationships whenever we have asserted or had expectations around boundaries. We've probably been taught that people who have good boundaries are actually aggressive and bad, selfish. The reason it's important to get good boundaries and solve our temporal lobe conflicts is that these conflicts profoundly affect our happiness, our relationship, and our sense of self, not to mention the physical health symptoms that go along with temporal lobe conflicts. As long as we have these kinds of biological conflicts active in our psyches, we can't grow up, we can't form interdependent relationships based on trust and mutual respect, and we live in a state of constantly feeling like either a victim, a villain, or a rescuer. That makes us get pushed off course by every external event that enters our consciousness. Because when we're in temporal lobe conflicts, especially when we've got a constellation of 2 or more of them going on at the same time, we are not in touch with reality. It's not actually a healthy way to live. It is an emergency response, and it needs to be temporary. As I said, this is the norm for most of us today, though. But it doesn't mean we're doomed to chaos and constant drama in our lives. It just means we have to get good at boundaries, which is the evolutionary purpose of all temporal lobe conflicts. That's the 5th biological law of the Germanic New Medicine. Fortunately, although the symptoms of not having good boundaries are complex, actually having good boundaries isn't complicated at all. Having good boundaries means being able to sense and state no. N-O, no. All we have to learn is what to say no about and how to find and respect the right no's. So what is a boundary? A boundary, in biological terms, is a boundary around territory, and saying no means asserting territory. Now, territory is neither physical nor is it the opposite. It's not just a metaphorical or figurative concept. In Germanic healing knowledge, territory is biological. Territory is the masculine principle of caring so much about something or someone that you would give your life to provide for and protect it. Your masculine territory includes your loved ones as well as everything that provides security and nourishment for your loved ones. Things that you could experience as your territory might include your job or your company, people, maybe even literal resources like buildings, bank accounts, and so on. But territory, although it's biological, isn't those things. Territory exists only in your psyche. And I'm not saying it's your imagination, but it is not a physical thing. And, as I've said, territory is masculine. What that means is you only have and care about territory if you're in what we call masculine hormonal status. That means you're biologically male, or you're a pregnant or nursing woman, or you have a very young child, or a woman who's in menopause. For everyone else, what we're experiencing as territory is a compulsion produced by at least one temporal lobe conflict, and we're going to immediately lose interest in that as territory as soon as the conflict is solved in our psyche, because there is no such thing as feminine territory. There are feminine temporal lobe conflicts, but there is no such thing as feminine territory. Now, technically, the temporal lobe conflicts on one side of your brain are masculine, and those on the other side are feminine. Which temporal relays are masculine and which are feminine depends on your biological sex and your laterality. This is important because actually half the temporal lobe conflicts are feminine. We call them territorial conflicts, but half of them are not territorial. They are about territorial in a tangential sense, and I'll get to that shortly. But half the temporal lobe conflicts are feminine. That means they're not territorial because the feminine doesn't devote to providing for and protecting the territory. But the feminine very much depends on the existence of secure territory. So the feminine doesn't go around saying no and asserting boundaries. That's masculine. Then what does having good boundaries mean to the feminine? The feminine needs to feel the boundaries of the territory. The feminine needs there to be a secure territory held and protected by the masculine. And when the feminine has good boundaries, she can feel the no, which enables the feminine to create the yes within what is secure, loving, and true. We can only be vulnerable and in contact with reality when we can relax and feel safe. And we can only do that when we know that boundaries, limits, or structure, the no's, are absolutely dependable. Consider a 3-year-old child laughing, playing, doing art, chattering with her friends, building stuff in parallel, play with his buddies. This can't happen without clear structure, limits, safety, and no's. Now put that same 3-year-old child in the room with adults who are having an argument, or put the child alone in an empty parking lot in the middle of a crime-ridden zone, decaying part of the city. The feeling's very, very different. The child's no longer happily playing. They're not creating. They're not relating with others. That's what lack of boundaries means to the feminine. If you can't relax, your biology never stops initiating DHSs and special biological programs. It'll use whatever's going on. You'll have a DHS and a biological conflict and a special biological program because the sky was the wrong color this morning. While the masculine must secure territory in order to feel purposeful and meaningful, the feminine can only flourish if there is a secure container that we can count on to always be there for us, providing guidance and being there for us no matter what. So, for the masculine, having good boundaries means asserting the no. And for the feminine, having good boundaries means moving away from anything in which the limits or structures, the no's, can't be felt or discerned. The feminine doesn't create clear boundaries, but the feminine will not engage unless there are clear boundaries. And she'll tell the truth about why she's not engaging. That's what being vulnerable is. Okay, so why does not having good boundaries translate into health symptoms? It's because biologically speaking, boundaries are the limits of territory. Now that's really easy to understand for the masculine. This is my territory, this isn't my territory. This is my bailiwick, this is not my bailiwick. That person is respecting my territory, this other person isn't respecting my territory. That means your boundaries are the limits or the edge of your home, your space, your time, your goals, the resources you need to flourish, your skin and everything inside it, your place in the hierarchy or the group, thresholds and access. Your attention is another boundary, or the limit of your attention. Your reputation and the pace or tempo of your life. These are some examples of your boundaries are at the limits or edge of these things. The masculine temporal lobe or boundary conflicts are about problems providing for and protecting something or someone that is cherished. So we might have territorial fear. That's fear that we're going to lose our territory. Someone's going to break into the house and ruin the container. Or someone's going to say nasty things and ruin your reputation. Territorial fear will involve either the bronchus or the larynx, depending on your laterality and what other temporal lobe conflicts you've got going on. Territorial loss is the second masculine temporal lobe conflict. This is actually losing your territory. You're fired. Your wife divorces you and your kids don't want anything to do with you. That which you were providing for and protecting is no longer something you have access to. So that'll involve either your coronary arteries or your coronary veins, again, depending on your laterality and whatever else is going on in your psyche. Territorial anger is another masculine temporal lobe conflict or boundary conflict. This is when the territory itself is being difficult. Someone's not respecting the territory, putting themselves in danger. Someone's being deceitful. Someone's turning the thermostat up and opening all the windows. It's the territory itself putting the territory in danger. That'll involve either your stomach, gall duct, or liver duct, or pancreatic duct, or it'll involve the lining of your rectum on the other hemisphere, and that depends again on your laterality and so on. And the fourth masculine boundary conflict or temporal lobe conflict is inability to demarcate. This happens when you can't be sure if this is your territory or not. That'll involve either the left or the right side of your urinary tract. The feminine temporal lobe or boundary conflicts, on the other hand, they're not about territory. They're not about claiming and demarcating the territory and asserting the territory. They're about rejection from the territory. They are about not being protected and provided for, not being cherished. So the first one is going to be scare fright. This is a fear that we're going to be rejected from the container. Someone's going to break into the house and kill you, or someone's going to notice you have an opinion that you shouldn't and is going to punish you or exile you. This conflict in your psyche will involve larynx or bronchus, depending on your laterality and what else is going on in your temporal lobes at the moment. Second, we have sexual rejection. This is a sense of not being cherished and unconditionally loved, either because of being rejected as the feminine, or because of feeling sexually violated. To the psyche, they are both a violation of the feminine, and that's sexual rejection or sexual conflict. And it's going to involve the coronary veins and cervix or the coronary arteries, depending on your laterality and whatever else is going on in your psyche at the moment. Third, we have the feminine identity conflict. This is the sense that I am the troublemaker in the territory. I'm the cause of problems for others. I have compromised or destroyed the safe container because of who and what I am. This will involve either the lining of the rectum or the stomach, liver, gall, or pancreatic duct. And the last feminine conflict is inability to find the demarcation. So this is not knowing where I can be, what the rules are, what the limits are, what position I should take. I just don't even know. It's going to involve either the left or the right side of the urinary tract. I wanted to give some examples then of contrasting the masculine territory versus the feminine belonging. The masculine territory, for example, is your house, but the feminine would be being at home. A masculine conflict would be about losing a house or the threat of not having access to a house. A feminine conflict would be not feeling welcome in a home, feeling like a guest, feeling like an intruder, like you have to tiptoe, hide, perform, or brace. I'm not saying that feeling like that way causes a conflict. I'm saying that the conflict is feeling that way. When you feel that way, it's because you've got that temporal lobe conflict going on. One of those 4 feminine temporal lobe conflicts going on. A masculine territory is your personal space, for example. The feminine corollary would be embodiment in the space. So a masculine boundary problem is when someone or something's intruding into your personal space. But a feminine boundary problem would be not feeling safe to move, take up space, or let loose. When the feminine can't feel the no in relation to the space and personal space, then she can't feel the yes of ease. She makes herself small. So what happens is you freeze, you fawn, you become hyper-aware. Another type of masculine territory might be your time. The feminine would not care about time. The feminine boundary problem would be around spaciousness and rhythm. The masculine feels time, the feminine feels spaciousness and rhythm. So a masculine boundary problem might be having your time wasted or not being able to keep track of time. The feminine doesn't live on a stopwatch. The feminine lives in cycles and tempo and doesn't really have any thought about time. Another territorial idea is goals. Goals are masculine. The feminine desires. So the masculine is the goal. The feminine is the yes. Yes to that. I love that idea. I feel it. So when the feminine is having a boundary problem because the masculine isn't holding territory around a goal, the feminine boundary problem is going to feel like desire becoming unsafe. So the feminine's going to numb out, perform, and become indirect. I can't say yes to that. Rights and responsibilities are another type of a masculine territory. The feminine would be concerned with consideration. So when rights and responsibilities are clear and upheld, which is masculine territory, then the feminine is going to experience dignity, care, and being taken seriously. A masculine boundary demarcation in this regard is rights and responsibilities not being respected. And the feminine boundary violation here would be the feminine experience of not having dignity, not being cared for, and having to therefore justify basic needs or trying to earn belonging. So when someone's trying to earn belonging, they've got a feminine boundary problem. Masculine territory, another example, is the resources you need to flourish. The feminine needs trust. The feminine is going to feel trust when those resources are there. Feminine will then trust that the food will be there, that the support will be there, money can be there, help will be there, the roof's going to be there. It doesn't mean infinite abundance. It means a sense of enough. When there's a feminine boundary problem in relation to the resources, when the feminine can't feel the resources that we need to flourish, then we can't relax and what happens is we become grasping and manipulative. The masculine territory is your skin, your physical skin, and everything inside it. So your physical person. But the feminine corollary is sexuality and vitality. The feminine has to feel safe to receive touch and experience pleasure. When the feminine can't feel that no of, if no means no, limits of that, the feminine numbs, armors, and dissociates. Another type of masculine territory is your position in the hierarchy or group, your reputation, your status, for example. The feminine corollary is belonging. So when the feminine can't feel, or when the feminine has a boundary problem in relation to inclusion, feeling welcome, feeling social protection, when she can't feel the bounds of that, because the masculine container of hierarchy or group organization is, say it's unstable, then belonging becomes conditional and it becomes political and it's fragile. The feminine becomes hyper-attuned, performative, and anxious. Another type of masculine territory is thresholds and access. For the feminine, it's privacy and sovereignty. Your attention is masculine territory. It's your energy. The feminine corollary is safe witnessing. So The feminine needs devotion, not consumption. When attention is protected and clean, which is because masculine has asserted a boundary on attention, then the feminine experience is being seen, heard, and known. But when that attention is unboundaried, when it's like anybody can grab your attention anytime, then you experience overwhelm, distraction, and being pulled on by the world. That's a feminine boundary problem. And last example I have here for you today is the masculine territory of the pace or tempo of your life. When that's all squared and secure, when that is being asserted and the no is clear on the limit of that, then the feminine can feel ease. The feminine can experience rest, recovery, pleasure, creativity, spaciousness. When the tempo of your life is protected, you can expand. But when there's a boundary problem around the pace or tempo of your life, when life is rushed or chaotic, the feminine can only cope. I hope that gives a good example and overview of what boundaries are and what the lack of boundaries does to us, and why it's a big problem in the world right now, because so many of us are pretty bad at this and have active temporal lobe conflicts as a result. But what I'd like to leave you with today is that we can have great health just by having good boundaries. We can really make a difference to our well-being. To have good masculine boundaries, practice judging and discerning. Observe what you like and don't like, what you want and don't want, what you cherish and don't care about. Because every boundary is ultimately a clear no that protects a clear yes. Make your boundaries real by turning discernment into simple, consistent container rules. What fits stays, what doesn't goes. What preserves the territory is a yes, what threatens it gets a no. Decide faster, use defaults when you can't decide, and follow through so your no becomes reliable. Reliability is what turns a boundary from words into physics. You can start in a very practical sense. This drawer is for spoons and nothing else. You can make rules based on logic and what works best. But to have good feminine boundaries, you need to practice something else entirely. Practice feeling your actual feelings without judging. Notice fear, shame, anger, sadness. Feel them in your body. Name them honestly and let them be data instead of drama. Feelings are not reasons to act. They are information. The feminine doesn't create the boundary. The feminine recognizes boundaries. And the way she recognizes boundaries is through feelings. So as you get better at sensing contraction versus expansion, no versus yes, you become able to trust your inner signals and relax into belonging, safety, and desire. When the feminine can feel the edge as real and as a benevolent thing, when we can feel our boundaries not as things we need to crash through or kick against, but as something that cares about us and cherishes us, then we can finally abide. And when we can abide, our psyches, and therefore our brains and bodies, stop acting like life is an emergency. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mind Over Symptom. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe now and please share with a loved one. The Mind Over Symptom blog lives at mindtreehealth.net, where you can get your free training about the natural laws of healing, and you can also get support. I'm Lishwi Springford, your guide for radical self-healing.